My mother was often immature and irrational. When I'm being charitable, I attribute her immaturity to arrested development due to trauma. How would I have survived that trauma? I like to think I'd be like Primo Levi, articulate as hell, but then again, he committed suicide, so. My mother's name was Elishka, Elli for short. Her American nickname was Sasha. She said her mother and father had been to America, and she used to pester her mother to tell her all about it. And finally, in exasperation, her mother would tell her that in America, all the houses were upside down, so the roofs were on the ground and their cellars were in the air. And Elli was astounded. I know so little about Elli. Only saw glimpses of her in my mother. Elli swam and skied and played tennis and liked to dance. She went to Catholic school and was good at math and languages. She didn't like the skin that formed on hot milk, and she was repelled when she saw us eating it. She was not a mom who believed that when you feel depressed, you should, clean your bathroom to recover. Instead, you should put a cool washcloth over your eyes and lay down in a darkened room. At one point, my mother told me that her mother was sad most of the time. She attributed it to her father's philandering. My deep negativity comes from my mother, who had it from her mother. It was not just a war thing. Being negative is very European. I used to marvel at it, feeling slightly sickened, by the can-do, brisk American mothers who had this naive, moralistic worldviews. What else did I know growing up? Elli loved the movies and continued to love them as she got older, although she rarely went to the theaters. She mostly watched them on television. Her favorite post-war movie star was Bing Crosby, and I remember once my father came home and she told him, "Jack, I love another man." And he was horrified and all the blood rushed out his face. And then, "It's Bing Crosby," she told him, and he laughed in relief. The big star of her childhood was Rudy Valentino, which always confused me when I was small because her brother's name is Rudy and I was born on Valentine's Day. It seemed vaguely incestuous. A dark side of my mother's life was when Hitler came to Prague in late 1939 after my mother's 20th birthday. My mother was arrested sometime in 1942. Where was she? I don't know. I have one memory that she was in a classroom somewhere, another memory that they were at her house, but I do know that she never saw anyone in her family again after the arrest, and she was 22. One of the few war stories she ever told me about was there was a woman who's older than my mother and whom she had known her whole life, who was also at the camps, and they hung her in front of the entire camp. And my mother said that while they were standing and watching the hanging, she was thinking about the woman's slippers, which must still be by her bed, and she was hoping she could go back and get them before anyone else did. As a result, in her time at the camps, my mother had a lifelong aversion to naked light bulbs because there were such light bulbs overhead in the camps. Even though all the houses we lived in had overhead lights, she normally used floor lamps, except in the dining room. Maybe just the sight of a table full of food needed that illumination. I once thought to ask my mother how she traveled home from her camp near Berlin when the war ended. "How do you think?" she snorted. "I walked." But it's 174 miles from Berlin to Prague. I imagine my mother walking through the beautiful Central European spring with crowds of refugees on the road, and I didn't ask her if she walked with other people, but I imagine she did. I imagine her visualizing home and wanting to tell her mother about all the terrible things that happened while she was gone, but when they got there, or when she got there rather, they were all gone. My father only ever knew her as Sasha and didn't even know her childhood name was Elli until she was in her 70s. He cried when he told me that. He said he'd been a bad husband not to ask her more about herself, and I also feel I was a bad daughter for the exact same reason. It's hard to understand now why I didn't ask her more questions, but she never wanted to answer them. And I think I took her existence and her hidden history for granted.